Go ahead, Luca.
Yeah, I had a question, and maybe it's not 100% applicable because it kind of takes stuff that you talked about in topics that you didn't talk about in this class yet.
Sure.
And it was mainly to do with like some of the examples you were showing, like WhatsApp, Twitter, Slack, Radiant. Like I was surprised at the like when we talk about pivot, how it really could be like 180 degree, like complete different direction. And you kind of touch briefly.
Well, I would say, I mean, I don't think any of the I mean, in some sense, like it, let's look at like WhatsApp,
Yeah.
they're kind of starting like in the like very early Wild West era of smartphone. And yeah, like they have a terrible idea up front, but they're kind of like, you can tell like what they're doing is they're experimenting with stuff to try to figure something out. And then they stumbled on something that seemed like some unusual user behavior on the basis of something that they had kind of done on a whim, which was integrating push notification. Like they were one of the first companies to really realize like this push notification thing is hugely powerful as a tool for an app to use. But I wouldn't say that like it's a 180 degree turn, because they kind of knew they were just kind of, experimenting with things. And they were like, look, like we'll experiment with things with a smartphone because our gut tells us that like there's going to be interesting things that kind of, like interesting opportunities to pivot to. I'm pretty sure when they did the whole what's up thing, like status notification, like I don't think they actually believed that that was the killer thing that they were going to do. Mm-hmm. They were just like, this is like a vessel for experimentation, right? So they were kind of self-aware that they had to kind of pay attention to what folks were doing, right?
Okay.
Same thing, like, what I would say is like Radiant 6, like, it's not like they shifted 180 degrees because they were like leveraging the Twitter fire hose and stuff like that, mm-hmm. right? Like they were like, look, this data has got to be valuable in some way, shape, or form. We're going to like develop competence in like getting that data. We're going to secure like the necessary partnership with Twitter to be able to use the fire hose, and we'll build some software infrastructure above it. The thing that we initially build on it is probably not, like, again, like I'm pretty sure they didn't have a lot of conviction on their initial like detailed use case, but they probably had conviction around like the big picture of it all. Like, social media data is valuable. Like not only did they not 180 degree turn that, I would say they barely turned on that axis, mm-hmm. right? But on like the axis of who's your target customer, they like turned mega. Yeah. Right. And then once you turn mega on the customer axis point, but you're still like, more or less the same on the like Twitter fire hose. And at the time, Facebook fire hose was also something you could plug into. It's more difficult now. But like, given all of that, like then you rejig your product to re-optimize to your new customer base. And so then the product looks like it changes a lot. But actually it looks like it's changing more than it is because it's still being built off of the same flow of data, mm-hmm. right? So I would say like, this is something that's useful to think about, which is, yes, there's, even with major pivots, like there's still some stuff that usually doesn't change, right? And so I find it useful to kind of distinguish with an early stage startup idea, like what is the stuff you're really firm on? And it's usually like not detailed. It's like more of a big picture vision. It's like, this data has never existed before. I think it's valuable. Like you probably won't pivot out of that.
Okay.
Or if you do, you might as well just close up shop and hit the drawing board, refund from the beginning, right?
Yeah, that was the question. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say that was kind of the question I was leaning towards, because the reason I mentioned topics is because I was looking at like the the effing good boss framework for
Yeah.
founders that you
Which
were.
we will,
that you had
by the way,
shown.
cover in topic 2. Yeah.
Perfect. And I was kind of wondering, I think you answered it there. Like, how do you ride that fine line between having that fixation and having that second S, like the self-learner adaptive? And I think you kind of like touched on it there, where it's you have that one key insight, or one, even if it's not something detailed, that one general idea that you're focused on, and then you could be adaptive around the rest to make the pieces fall into place. So I think you pretty much answered what I was asking there.
Yeah. So like what Luca is, by the way, referring to is that I do teach another class where I've talked a little bit about, what you look for and found. I mean, I really barely talked about it in that class, but
Yeah.
Luca's watched a video that I referenced to, which is also a video that's being referenced to in this class, and that I will give well, I guess I'm not going to give a proper lecture on, because I'm thinking of doing that when I guess if we're in person, who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks, right? But like, but so like he's talking about like characteristics that I look for, and I say I, but like a lot of VCs look for in startup founders. And what they look for is this kind of very delicate balance between being visionary and like firm on something big picture, but being like super flexible on like the details around that vision. And like, always have to be a little bit careful, because it's not like we have this brilliant data set that's perfect, right? But like anecdotally, if you pay attention to some of like the best founders, they seem to have both of those characteristics, which may seem a little bit at odds with each other at first glance, because on the one hand, you're inflexible, on the other hand, you're flexible, right? With startups, you kind of need to kind of think about that and ask yourself, like, what should you be inflexible on? What should you be flexible on? Because that kind of governs how you approach learning and adapting, especially early on in the life cycle of a startup. Because it's not realistic that you go and change everything every day, right? Like, just because you didn't sell something to a customer yesterday doesn't mean that you got a terrible startup idea, right? And so you have to kind of have this delicate balance of like what you react to versus what you don't. That I kind of like don't go into a lot of the nitty gritty on this, even in the discussion of the search for product market fit stuff. I say, test and learn is one thing to say test and learn. It's another thing to actually do it, right? And some of this requires like making judgment calls on like, what are you what are you open to change versus, what is like less changeable, right? I mean, like in my search for product market fit, I give the Twitter example as well, right? Like ODO becoming Twitter.
Yeah, you do.
Right. Like that's probably the closest thing to like a 180 out of all of the examples I did. Like that's like a 179, and indeed, like, because it was pretty much a 180, they went back to their investors and offered them their money back. Because they're like, if you do a true 180, that's not what folks bought into. And if they don't believe in that, they will be pissed. And so Twitter literally went back to every single one of their VC outside investors. Well, I say Twitter, but they were called ODO at the time. They went back to every single one of them and offered them their money back. And then they found, and by the way, like a fair amount of them took the money back. Boy, do they regret it. And then they basically lined up other people to reinvest in the new thing. One of which was my housemate. Well, he wasn't my housemate when he did it, but he was my housemate prior to that. Yeah, he happened to have been Dorsey's main mentor in the several years before Twitter was started. Yeah, so like most pivots are not that extreme, Luca. Usually when it's that extreme, at least the founders who realize they don't want to piss people off will basically offer people their money back as a courtesy. And if they're not able to get anyone to believe on their new thing, it probably is something they should be mindful of. or they just kind of have to do it at a smaller scale initially. I mean, you know, at the end of the day, like with Twitter, they were able to raise the money. But like, yeah. So yeah, it's, you know, there's this question of like, what do you adjust versus what do you not adjust? Yeah, I'm not sure if that helps.